Welcome to Aspire, and I Have the Right To podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent. Welcome to another podcast of Aspire. And I hesitated right there because I was trying to figure out, do I say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening? Because we have a very special episode in store for our listeners today with my co-hosts, Gabriel Viscogliosi and Hugh Eastman. But we also have a very special guest today, Dr. Stephen Burrell, and I am very excited. We're all very excited about our discussion today. But as we were prepping for this, we realized that we have Ben, our fearless podcast producer, sitting in Portugal, and it's around midnight, his time. And I am sitting in Hong Kong, where it is 7 a.m. And Stephen, what time is it down under in Australia?
It's 9:20 in the morning here, so yeah.
Excellent. And our co-hosts, you want to say hello and what time it is?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's 7:20 p.m., so I think we got the easier side of this, the timing difference.
Well, and sorry to bore you all with these details, but I wanted to mention that because one of the topics and themes we wanted to talk about today was taking advantage of this global presence right now and diving into the topic of masculinity, whether it's socially constructed masculinity or aspirational masculinity, and dive into some of the themes that might cut across wherever we might be located. But first, before we dive into the discussion, I'd like to introduce our guest today, Dr. Stephen Burrell, who's joining us from Australia. Dr. Burrell is a lecturer in criminology at the University of Melbourne. Dr. Burrell is originally from the UK and moved to Australia at the beginning of 2024. His research is about men, masculinities, and violence. He is particularly interested in the prevention of men's violence, especially violence against women and violence against the environment, and promoting care as an alternative. He is a big fan of feminism, drinking tea, connecting with nature, eating vegan snacks, and listening to heavy metal. But Stephen, welcome to the Aspire podcast.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. And I just feel privileged to be invited. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, Stephen also is co-host and co-founder of the wonderful podcast, Men and Now. And I would highly suggest to our listeners to check this podcast out. We started this podcast last year. We conceptualized it last year as an internship project by our co-hosts, Hugh and Gabriel. And it's really blossomed into a wonderful discussion about the challenges young men face today in terms of the expectations that society has for them in terms of how they should be functioning as a man in our society. And we felt the importance of having discussions around providing an alternative view for our young people and actually doing some of the work for all men to sort of understand how do we become the best versions of ourselves. And such a simple, logical concept, how challenging it is to even have discussions on this topic. And Stephen, I have to tell you, when the first time I heard your podcast, probably the fall of last year, was a breath of fresh air in the environment. And hearing two men having very frank and open discussions and bringing on amazing guests to talk about masculinity in all its forms and the impacts, positive and negative, these forms can have, on us. And I am a little bit of a fanboy, so very excited to have you on.
Oh, thank you. No, it's nice for me to be on the other side of the the interview for a change. And it's just great. I think we need, we set up the podcast a few years ago because we felt that there was a real need. There's quite a lot of perhaps more negative content out there online, right, aimed at boys and men, and we felt that there was a need for something more positive, which actually was engaging with feminism and gender equality and issues to do with masculinity in a more positive way. And so it's wonderful. I think we need more podcasts, more online websites and, materials which are really trying to have positive conversations with boys and men about these issues. So, yeah.
Well, can you explain, Stephen, because I am a nuisance when I meet people who I admire and love their work. But for some reason, I'm always inherently curious as to what brought people to what they do. And could you share what brought you to having this interest in feminism and also this interest in studying masculinity and also creating the podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess for me, I suppose I've been on this journey for a while now. I first came into contact with kind of feminism and issues like violence against women when I was a teenager, probably maybe a similar age to Hugh and Gabriel, actually. So I was lucky enough to get to study sociology at school. I'm from the UK originally, so this was back in the UK, at what we would call a sixth form college. I was about 16 years old, and I started doing sociology. And I was already perhaps, questioning a lot of what was going on around me. Like I was becoming quite passionate about environmental issues. This was the time of the Iraq War. So there was a lot of kind of political discussion going on about that. I loved sociology very much. And in particular, I had a teacher who was this great, kind of feminist teacher, and she was talking to us about feminism. And I guess my class was mainly young women. But I think, for me, it really impacted on me as well, actually, because I guess, as a teenage boy, so much actually of what these feminists were saying actually resonated so much with my life as well, and the kind of discomfort I had felt, I suppose, from a young age. I didn't really have the language to understand or explain it at that time, but I guess then I started to understand that actually, why do I feel so uncomfortable among my peers? What is it that's making me feel out of place, and that you feel like you have to fit in as a young person, but you also don't feel particularly comfortable with what you're expected to fit into. As a young man. And to be honest, I think I went through quite a lot of strife as a teenager, trying to deal with those pressures and expectations that exist as a young man. And I guess I gradually came to understand that actually this had a lot to do with masculinity. That I just didn't really feel comfortable with these ideas about masculinity that were being, circulated all around me, really. I was lucky to grow up in a very loving, supportive household. My parents, I think, were kind of modeling gender equality in lots of ways. So probably that gave me a bit of a head start in thinking about these things in that light as well. And so then I went to university and I started studying these things more. And I guess the more I learned about feminism, really, the more I realized, that this is something which is very much applies to my life. As a man, and that actually I as a man have a role to play here. And actually this is something which is really going to enhance my life in so many ways. And so then it was like, well, what can I do as a man? And I guess the obvious thing was to talk to other men and boys about this. I think that's what, I was hearing from the kind of feminists I was engaging with. And in particular to what can we do about, violence against women and girls, really, because that is just right at the center of kind of gender inequality in our society, really, isn't it? And obviously that is violence which is being done predominantly by us men. So I felt a real sense of responsibility to try and make a small contribution towards the efforts to ending that. And I loved sociology, so I kind of knew I wanted to work in academia and research. So these two things just kind of came together, really, and I just feel very privileged actually to get to to get to work on issues that I'm really passionate about on a day-to-day basis in my academic work. And yeah, I guess the podcast is that we created is a way of trying to get these ideas out there more broadly, because I just feel so lucky that I've had the chance to learn about feminism and engage with that. And I think lots of boys and men aren't really getting that opportunity. So I just want to spread the message more widely, I suppose. And I think podcasts can play a really useful role in that, can't they? So, yeah.
That is amazing. Yeah, I'd like to turn it over to Hugh and Gabriel for their thoughts and connection to what you just said.
Well, I really appreciate what you said, Dr. Burrell, about the pressures that we face, because I think it's something so relevant to not only just men and people in their later life, but as you mentioned in your own experience, being a child. I think we're sort of forced to conform to a certain standard or a certain way as a quote unquote man. And I think you cover it very well. I haven't gotten to check out every single episode of Now and Men, but I think that the topics you cover are certainly very relevant to our discussion. And I actually had a question for you, because with these relevant pressures, I know Alex mentioned earlier, we've talked about how we don't necessarily want to put men down, as our goal with our podcast and your podcast is to bring them up in, as you described, a more positive light. So my question for you is, what do you see in a current listener's life or in our own life as a way that they can positively contribute to this culture of aspirational masculinity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. No, and I totally agree with you, and I think there is great research by academics in the US, actually, like Niobe Way. I don't know if you've had her on the podcast yet. If not, you totally should, which shows, that actually they've done research with boys from a young age, which shows, that boys are actually very much capable of being emotionally perceptive and caring, and yeah, of really kind of being attentive to other people and their emotional, needs. But actually, that's something that society kind of forces us to push down and bury and kind of cut ourselves off from. So that the point here is not, that there's something wrong with boys and men. The problem is with society, and how that's teaching us like that we should be. And I think that's what I felt really uncomfortable with, as a boy and a young man myself, because I think, my mum always told me, I was quite sensitive, as a boy. But I guess society doesn't really encourage or allow that, does it? It doesn't really encourage boys and men to be sensitive and emotional and to kind of talk to people about those things, or to kind of look out for other people's emotions, and to be to have an awareness of those. Even though actually, yeah, we're totally capable of these things, and I think that that's really damaging for us, and I think it leads to all sorts of damaging outcomes for everybody in the end. Yeah, so that was something, I think that was, fundamentally what I was feeling uncomfortable about. But I don't think it's just me, right? I think that we're all actually quite sensitive and we're all quite emotional. We have so many emotions, like all of us as humans, it's we have incredibly rich, like, inner lives, and we feel so much all the time. But yeah, I guess our society kind of it forces us to push those things down and bury them, and that, yeah. So I think in terms of what we can do positively, I think first of all, we can look inside ourselves and kind of think about who are we, like who is the person we want to be, and how can we put that into practice on a day-to-day basis, even if that does mean actually going against some of the pressures and norms and expectations that we're facing all around us, that, yeah, maybe that means we have to be a bit brave sometimes and go against the grain a bit, go against some of what our peers are saying and doing. But I think actually in the long term, we'll actually be much happier in ourselves, that if we feel proud of the person we are and the fact that we are actually living according to our values and our ethics, then that in the end, I think, is really good for us. And, if we recognize that actually, yeah, there's nothing wrong with emotions, and there's nothing wrong with me being vulnerable or supposedly showing weakness sometimes, because we're all vulnerable sometimes. We all need help sometimes. And actually, it takes a lot of bravery to say that, So yeah, and I guess this isn't just about ourselves, of course. I think this is about showing care for other people, around us, for our community, for society. And again, care is something which we as men are discouraged from showing. But again, boys and men care about so much, right? We do love and care so many things and people around us, and we should feel able to show that. And I think one way that we need to show that is by actually speaking out when we encounter, injustice and harm and oppression. And unfortunately, that exists so much in our society as well. And unfortunately, it often is coming from other, men. So I think we have a responsibility as well to question that, when we see it in a day-to-day basis, and to try and model something different to that. And I think that actually, as I said, that's a really positive contribution, and that's something we ourselves gain so much from as well. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think that makes me very hopeful as well. That message that you're able to get across. Because at least in my own life, obviously, and also in the lives of my friends, I've heard friends come up to me and talk to me about these things and say, they don't really have a place to turn to with this. And I think that this is the goal of this podcast, and getting that message out there that it's okay to talk to someone about this and who you really are as a person, which I think is a very important theme of this idea of aspirational masculinity that we try to promote. I think that the connection to one's own core and one's own self is definitely at the top of the list. I know I see Alex smiling because I know we've talked about this a bunch, and the image of the three-part whole, who we really are externally versus at our core. And yeah, I think thank you for your response. That really reminded me of that, and it makes me very hopeful. So thank you again.
Yeah, and I just heard so many interesting things that caused my brain to just continue to churn. And this is why I love doing this podcast, because what we're talking about is such a bizarrely new field, a new discussion area on a problem that's existed since mankind has been on the earth. And, Stephen, as you were talking, and we are big fans of Niobe Way, and she's really informed much of our work in terms of the importance of connection and, the humanity. And she also helped give me hope and reminding me that in our existence as men, we are all good people. And I do inherently believe that. Through a lot of our experiences, I've had to question some of that. But because I've been able to reconnect with that inherent goodness, it's inspired this work on aspirational masculinity. But I also remember something that I've told my kids at home when they're little, or even colleagues at work, is the truth is always the best thing. Because if you say a lie, you're going to need to cover it up with another lie, and no one is smart enough to remember all the lies they have to weave to cover up the truth. So it's much better just to acknowledge things. And for some reason, that image or thought came into my head as you guys were talking, because think about how difficult it is for our young men to deny who they are at that age of the beginning of socialization, when our young boys leave the home for the first time and leave that protective cocoon, and then are faced with the various tropes or stereotypes that they're expected to conform to. Just imagine if you always have to act instead of acting instinctively based on who you are, and how easy it is to lose your own identity because you do feel like you need to perform and how quickly you can lose sight of your values. And Hugh, thank you for bringing back our 3-part whole diagram, which you guys know is my favorite diagram. And frankly, I'd love to dive into this topic a little bit now with you, Stephen. And maybe I'll start it with a question, to you, sort of asking, if I had to ask you, what are 3 descriptors of Stephen in his core, in terms of your sort of base existence? How would you describe yourself?
Oh, that's a very good question.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No. Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, I probably would say. I mean, I'm thinking about different emotions here. I don't know if that's on the right track, but I mean,
there are no wrong answers.
I mean, it's interesting actually, isn't it? Because one thing I actually think about is like, I feel like I'm quite passionate as a person, and maybe actually quite angry, which is interesting, isn't it? Because I guess anger is perhaps one of the few emotions that we do permit men to express, and that can be really damaging, both for men ourselves and also for women and people around us. But actually, anger, I think, I mean, all emotions are like are valid, aren't they, and needed, and they're just part of what we feel. So, we shouldn't, necessarily feel bad about that, right? It's more about what do we do with those emotions? How do we process them? How do we communicate them? But yeah, I feel a lot of anger actually about the world, and about the scale of injustice and the fact that we as humans are capable of so much good, but there is so much going on in the world where you're just seeing the opposite of that because of people acting in their own self-interest. People who have power are determined to keep the power that they've got, or concentrate it more and more in their hands, and it's just really sad, and I just don't think that makes people happy in the long term. I think even those people who are predominantly men, who have most power in our societies and are doing whatever they can to kind of keep hold of that, I don't think that's making them happy in the long run. So yeah, I actually feel a lot of anger, and about the state of the world, but I tried to use that as a motivator, and it certainly does motivate me, and yeah. But so I guess maybe another word I'd use would be maybe kindness or care, and that's not to say that I am some kind of embodiment of those things, but more that those are traits which I really think are like fundamentally who I want to be, because that's how I get like meaning and purpose and contentment, I suppose, right, is by trying to care for others and try and do kind things, which does mean also showing forgiveness, right? That, we can feel outraged when we do see these terrible things going on around us. But actually, I also think that we shouldn't sink to the level of some of that behavior. And actually, we should be willing to also be willing to show forgiveness and try and understand where that behavior is coming from. Because as we were discussing before, right, we all have the capacity to do both good and bad, and we have to believe that people, even if they've done really harmful things, that they're capable of change. And I firmly believe that, and I've seen people change. I've experienced change in myself, so I know that we as humans are capable of change as well. And so I think that's really what motivates me in this work as well, is I see kind of trying to be an ally as being about caring for others, caring for ourselves, and also caring for other men, right? Knowing that we as men are capable of better than what a lot of us are doing in the society we live in currently. And I guess if we model kindness as well, then hopefully, I do think that can be infectious, because if we all just take a step back from acting selfishly, then that kind of that gives permission for others to do the same, I think, doesn't it? But somebody has to do that, to take the first step. So And maybe just one last thing is just because you mentioned it already. This is much more mundane, but I'm a big fan of sweet. I have a big sweet tooth. I'm a big fan of chocolate and ice cream and these things. But I did become vegan last year, which has, been a little bit of a challenge about finding new things to snack on, which I really enjoy. But I've actually been really enjoying doing that. And actually, that's also motivated by the things I was just saying, right? That also, how can we show compassion and kindness to other beings, not just humans as well? Yeah.
I just want to go back to the idea on change that you were talking about, because I think change, especially in this very complex and changing time of the current state of masculinity, I think that's such an important topic to talk about. But I think often men are kind of confused on how they can adapt to this change and how they can kind of rise to the change and actually become this aspirational man that we often talk about on our podcast. So I know you've done a lot of research kind of in this realm. So one question I would pose to you is, in your research, what are some, let's say, surprising or counterintuitive things that you've discovered about how men understand their own masculinity, and how you've used that information that you've learned to kind of understand it more deeply, and how this changing state of masculinity can be better suited for everyone and how they can embrace their whole self?
That's a great question. I mean, one thing I think about is just because you mentioned about change, right? And we live in a hugely changing world, like, in so many ways. And actually, it's a world of crisis at the moment, I think, really, isn't it? We're facing multiple, compounding crises, which I think for you as young people in particular must be incredibly, daunting and scary if you're looking at your future, and everything that's going on in the world, whether that's, the climate crisis or wars. We're seeing wars and militarization of societies happening more and more, at the moment. We've got economic crises, after the COVID pandemic, we've got a cost of living crisis. So many people are struggling to make ends meet at the moment. And obviously that's really hard to deal with, isn't it? Like, for us as humans, there's just a lot of stuff going on for us to kind of deal with, and I think lots of people are really struggling with that. And I do think that with these ideas of masculinity that we have, I think maybe sometimes men are particularly ill-equipped to deal with some of these things, right? Because we learn that we have to be rigid, and stoical, and kind of keep silent. And maybe we're not very well equipped to adapt, to be flexible and to be willing to kind of accept that the world is changing, and that actually change is really scary, but it can also be a really good thing, because clearly, the way things are at the moment in society is not working very well for most men, and so actually change is good for all of us. And we need to embrace that, So even with something like the climate crisis, right, that's really scary. But actually, how could that be a positive thing? Not a positive thing in and of itself, but how could that lead to positive change among us as humans, to kind of recalibrate our relationship with nature, in much more sustainable, mutually beneficial ways, for example. I suppose gender equality, right? That in some ways that means that some of us as men have to give up some power in a sense, but in the other hand, actually, it means we gain so much, and actually sharing power, all of us together, is so much better, as we were discussing before, than just concentrating in the hands of a few people. So I guess in terms of your question, I think one of the interesting things for me that I've learned about masculinity in our societies is that, so much of it is about projecting strength and power and control. But underneath that, there's actually so much fear and anxiety and fragility, and, that we're all just like terrified as men, really, that people are going to find out that we're actually not very strong. We're not very powerful underneath that. We're all constantly in fear, of living up to these impossible expectations. And, sometimes when that is revealed, when that fear and anxiety and pain is revealed, then men do, lash out. But I think if we were all just a lot more honest about the fear that we're feeling and the fact that these expectations are ridiculous and unhelpful for all of us, then we'd all be a lot better off, I think. Yeah.
So, again, just so much rich content in that short little conversation that I have to dive into some more. you were just talking about, change. The question was around change. But and also, Stephen, you said the importance of, when talking about the environment, this importance of recalibrating with nature. But the immediate thought that came into my head is we need to recalibrate with ourselves. And going back to, the three qualities of Stephen Burrell that I asked you to describe. Really, when I Have the Right To goes out and speaks at schools and speaks to young men around the country, we want to go through exercises with all the young men to challenge them to do that exercise and to sit and think, because as you can imagine, many of the young men, obviously, since we're speaking to high schools, none of them are there voluntarily necessarily. They're there because we're speaking to the school, and especially some of the older young men who might be more of the alpha types will be sort of sitting there, with their arms crossed saying, why do I need to listen to this? Because is this really going to make me stronger, have more power, have more control? And I love the way you just described what is really existing underneath all of that is fear, is anxiety, is pain, but you're not allowed as a man to ever express that, which then, thinking logically, it's a natural next conclusion. Therefore, we have this mental health crisis, which leads to explosions of harm, whether it's self-harm or externalized harm. So again, when we lay these things out, it is such a logical story that we're telling, yet there's so much, resistance. But from my simplistic view, as a father of a survivor who's had to make sense of the world, is to say, to me, it really is just an exercise of reconnecting to who you think you are when you were brought into this world. And, for me, I really imagine that every human being is a loving, caring, supportive person, right? And we manifest that in different ways. But I picture my own three kids when they were really little, when I sort of envision that. And it really pains me to think of what we as the older generation have allowed to happen in terms of this piling on. And I think, Hugh, you were the one who described it brilliantly. Do you want to talk about, how you described this sort of creation of armor as a young person?
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, I know we've talked a lot about armor on this podcast, but I think it's just so real. Obviously, the title of this podcast is, or the part of this podcast that we're working on is titled Real Men, Real Conversations. So I think that this is so relevant to all boys and young men, and I'll quickly explain it. I feel that I've seen in my own life, and honestly, coming from my perspective, I haven't been able to avoid this either. But there's a certain form of armor or a certain form of protection that we take on that prevents us from breaking out and embracing our true self. So I think that can take form anywhere, even with friends, on a sports team, anywhere in your own life. It just refers to this expectation and this building up of armor that as soon as you get older, it almost becomes impossible to take off. And so we talk about breaking free from this armor. And Alex has described how in his own experience, he feels that he almost built up this armor, and then this event in his life with Chessie being assaulted was kind of the chip in it that allowed him to break free. But the unfortunate thing is that a lot of men build up this, metaphorical armor and never are able to break free. So I think the goal that we're really trying to achieve here is self-awareness and people being aware of this armor that is being built up at a young age, because before it becomes impossible to obviously take off. And I know I'm explaining this very metaphorically, but I think that you can almost envision it if you're aware of it, that it is this prevention and this real form of protection that we feel helps us avoid our true selves and who we really want to be.
And I think one other very important part of the armor that we talk about is, let's say you do break this armor down and you're left very vulnerable, but you're also more comfortable. But then you become surrounded by people who still have that armor up. I think very often people put down that armor so they feel like, okay, I did it. I'm finally going to be able to express my feelings. But then when they finally do it, they're met with people who have that armor fully built up. So they're met with this kind of immediate block when they try to express their feelings, because they have all this armor that they shed off through many years. And the first time that they try to express it, they're met with an immediate block. So now they kind of want to build back that armor. So I think additionally, it's really important to break down this armor yourself. But I think it's also very important to encourage everyone else around you to break down that armor. So it's a continuous breaking down, and it's one that stays broken down forever. And it's not something that comes back and continues to come back, but you really are able to feel comfortable with it being broken down and encourage others to break it down as well. So you're able to feel comfortable in a community, which I think is really important in building this idea of aspirational masculinity. It's this idea of community and what we want to instill in others and not just in ourselves.
Can I just jump in there? I think that's really well put, and I think that's one thing we as men really need to do, isn't it? Is to actually support each other, so that when men do take that risk, that step of being vulnerable, of admitting to something, some sort of supposed weakness, that we're actually supportive and encouraging of that, and we embrace that. And because I think that's it, isn't it? I think that's a big part of how we learn to shut down and build up that wall of armor, is because every time we are vulnerable, it's pushed away, and people might laugh at us or mock us or just not really know how to deal with it, So actually something we can do as men, as you said, is not just to look inside ourselves, but to support each other in breaking down that armor. Yeah.
This is such profound discussion for 7 a.m. in the morning Hong Kong. And Stephen, as you can probably see, this is why I love and I do this podcast, because I learn from these young men constantly. And it helps me understand as an older person, and I want to get your reaction to this if you had the same reaction, the responsibility that we have, not only to talk about it, but to model it. As you said this before, I love the way you said it. Modeling it makes it infectious, right? But it is so inherently ingrained in us through the decades that silence is the safe spot, right? But that safe spot is very destructive to who we are as individuals. So, I live in a very capitalistic world with my career, and and whether it's politics or business, there's always talk about self-interest or national interest, but it seems to be so limiting, right? Because what we're looking for is the best for our communities, right? And yet we can become so small in the way that we think and act on a daily, basis. But through your work, whether it's personally or academically, or through the experience of speaking to so many guests on your podcast, what have been some of the lessons that we can sort of take away to say, this is, we all know this is the right way to be. Yet we know there's so many right ways to do things, yet we always default to the lowest common denominator.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah. I mean, I think one thing which I've learned is that like this is a constant journey, you know. It's a never-ending process. Like, you know, it's like you never get to a point when you're like cured, you know, of kind of patriarchal ways of thinking, you know, or and I guess, and that goes back to what we're discussing as well, really, doesn't it? That I suppose, you know, some of the things we associate with masculinity, you know, is like perfection. You know, you should strive for perfection, and that you should never show any kind of fallibility. You know, you always have to be right. But like, actually, yeah, I think it's incredibly. It's actually quite freeing in a sense, isn't it, to recognize that actually, like, I'm going to get things wrong, you know, and I do get things wrong all the time. But that's okay because I'm only human, you know. We're all you know, flawed human beings, and I think that, yeah. So first of all, I think being prepared to you know, accept that we're going to get things wrong. So like even you know, if we're really passionate about gender equality, you know, and we really want to be like a great ally, you know, to women, you know, we no matter how much reading, you know, yeah, like I've read lots and lots of feminist texts and you know, but I still get things wrong. I still make mistakes, you know, because this kind of the way that I've been brought up in this world, you know, is very deeply embedded within me, you know, so I am going to get things wrong, and therefore I need to be prepared to listen, you know, to the women in my life, to my friends. Also, just, you know, if I see a video or read something written by a feminist and I find it uncomfortable, you know, that I need to sit with that and not just immediately push back against that, you know, but actually be like prepared to listen and learn and think, oh yeah, maybe the way I've seen things even now is actually still, you know, a bit problematic in some way, and there's something for me to learn here, you know, and just be prepared to take on board that feedback. You know, I think that's something which we all need to do, because it's a constant journey, and you just learn new things all the time about ways in which kind of patriarchal ways of thinking are embedded within you. But I think also that's something which can put men off maybe from getting involved in this kind of work, because they know that they have got things wrong in their lives and they've done things that they're not proud of, you know. They've you know, maybe they've stayed silent when their friends have been sexist or misogynistic, you know, or maybe they've behaved in ways in their own relationships that they're not proud of, you know, or they've used pornography, or, you know, there's so many ways in which we're all complicit in this, and maybe then it's easier to just deny that this is a problem altogether,
right,
you know, than be willing to embrace the things about ourselves that we're not proud of. But, you know, so if we're all more willing to accept, I think, that, you know, we do get things wrong, but we're also capable of doing something different, then I think maybe that will open up the path towards change for lots more men. Yeah.
I'd actually like to go back and kind of relate my own experience with this topic that we've been talking about, of armor, and how connection kind of allows you to take off this armor. Because a week ago, or I think now 2 weeks ago, we had our first consent summit at Riverdale, the first annual consent summit that was founded at our school, and which Alex spoke at, and we were very excited to have him. But through that, I've mentioned this podcast to my friends, and they're very aware of it, and they've listened to a couple of episodes. But after that speech, and after this consent summit, these two friends that I had that haven't been so involved in this work, but have shown some interest, came up to me and they said, you know, wow, this is something that's so true. And, you know, we really want to get involved in this work. And I think that that's something that they were comfortable with saying, partly because they were someone I could trust with this topic. And I think trust is also important in the way that we're allowed to be vulnerable with someone. But it's interesting how we see how my friends or other people around this feel the same way, in that they want to be, they want to take action in this topic, but it kind of takes that little push of hearing Alex speak, or attending a consent summit to actually be interested. And that's honestly what got Gabriel and I interested in this topic. So I think that form of connection and pushing the relevance of this topic in our own society allows us to be our whole self, and really express ourselves in a way that we want to be. And yeah, I think.
I also think that that kind of need of an extra push also applies, I would say, to a lot of men with the idea of feminism and that topic. So I would ask you, Dr. Burrell, how do you think you can kind of reframe the narrative of feminism for men and how so they can engage with it more and be more open and so they don't have some stigma around it? Because I know especially this idea of feminism for many men, they feel like they need an extra push, but instead it should be something that should be comfortable for them and they should be willing to talk about and be engaged about without needing that extra push. Or how would you, let's say, how do you tell other people or inform other people to kind of flip this narrative?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, I mean, and it's an uphill battle, right? Because I guess there are lots of forces in our society which are trying to spin a certain message about feminism, which is just unhelpful, and in the media, politicians, obviously on the internet, there are lots of men out there who are kind of really trying to blame feminism, I suppose, for the problems that we have as men, which is just it's very harmful, and I think that's because people are afraid. People are afraid of, as I said, of losing the power that they've got. They want to keep things as it is in terms of the status quo. And some people, some men in positions of power, often feel threatened by feminism. So we need to. I think we all have a responsibility, especially as men, to if we have had that, that good fortune to encounter a more accurate, interpretation of feminism, like actually listening to what feminists are saying, engaging with their work, having women in our lives, who are passionate about these issues. If we've had that good fortune, then we have to do whatever we can to get that message out there to other men, I think. But it can't just be down to individuals, I think. I think that this is something which, we as individuals only have so much power. We do all have a responsibility and we have the capacity to help create change, but it has to come from all the different levels of society, and so we do need to be doing prevention work, in schools, in workplaces, in universities, where we're actually talking about gender equality. We're talking about violence and abuse. We're talking about these harmful ideas of masculinity, and how we can be different. Because as you said, that helps to give that push, right? That gives people the opportunity to learn about these things, because otherwise they're just not going to, or what they will hear will be a very partial or inaccurate view that some aspects of the media are painting about feminism, for example. Yeah.
So, it's interesting because, the push, I think, is absolutely important because there's so much inertia here that there needs to be actually a full throttled, two-handed, push in many cases. But I also think it's really important, if we're going to reach the people that need to hear these messages, is there needs to be a pull. And that's why we quite, intentionally have gravitated to the way Don McPherson, who's been another mentor of mine, a former pro athlete and a person who was a mentee of Jackson Katz, so the lineage, sort of continues, to have a positive view, right? And Don has taught me the importance of understanding the power in our wholeness, right? And so this is not something to do for others, because it's a good thing to do. And then we debate whether we're giving up anything or not. But we need to do this for ourselves in order to be the best versions of ourselves, to pursue the excellence that we want to pursue. So, I think it's also equally important to let people know that there's an absolute benefit to men for embracing their wholeness. The way you described your three qualities, Stephen, was beautiful. And what I loved about it was the pause that you took, because I could see in your eyes, your body, I could see the journey going from your brain through your muscles to your core to the soul, right? And trying to connect there. And I imagine all of us have cobwebs or scar tissue or other things that we need to break through. And unless we exercise that and clear those pathways, we can never make that journey, which we need to be the best versions of ourselves. But the way you said it, I want to almost do another episode with you on this, on the topic of, because you eventually got to the topic of forgiveness. And I think that's such an important thing for men to think and contemplate and kick around and talk about, because the fear of seeking forgiveness blocks so much beauty and positivity and production, right? Because we just pile over mistakes, thinking of failure, and we can't seek and get and be willing to identify that we need forgiveness. And also the competitive nature of men. We don't want to give forgiveness. We just want to eliminate that person. And me, as a dad of a survivor, I've had to grapple with this whole concept of forgiveness, right? Because of harm caused. But I want to get back to, first, you said you're passionate, which is clear, to see, and it exudes, from your aura, right? But then you made this fascinating comment as you were thinking more, you attached to anger. And to me, that was powerful, because what was clear was in the socially constructed version of masculinity, anger is it's all of your emotions coming out of the one hole that men are allowed to show, which is the anger hole, right? So there's no control, because it's like 50 different emotions, and it's just coming out in one way. And it's not really thoughtful or intentional or whatever. It's just, okay, this is the only way I can express all this range that I'm feeling. But what I got from the way you said it is that you've utilized your wholeness. You've utilized your vulnerability and your caring side and your empathy and other elements of your wholeness. Because even the way you talked about anger it wasn't just a destructive, knock down everything in its path anger, but it was like, this anger is, even the way you said it, it's my fuel, to be passionate about these other, topics. So, I just made notes to myself. We don't have enough time to sort of cover this topic, but I would love to stick a placeholder, on this, because I think for so many young men, the concept of forgiveness, because we all F up, right? We all mess up. And the easiest thing to do is to feel such shame and such fear and hesitation that, Niobe Way has a wonderful story about this tragic story about suicide of this one young person that she, worked with, who felt so isolated at school that this person doubled down on that identity of being different and strange. And, it led to such a self-destructive, path. And, I think it's so important for us to have conversations with our young men to talk about this importance of saying, we did an episode on failure, and actually my co-host had a much easier time talking about it than I did. Because for me, I grew up in an era where the saying was failure is not an option, right? But the best way for you to learn and grow is through your mistakes, right? And that's how we become the best versions of ourselves. And so maybe we will have the benefit of another appearance by you. But I think we are running close to our time. And, one of the purposes for this episode that I wrote down was creating space to talk, with young men, for young men, to hear from each other. And I am so grateful, Stephen, for you joining us, because you've been a voice out literally, in the wilderness, right? Meaning this topic is such an untalked about topic. For some reason, Australia seems to be this sort of country that is willing to talk about this or to talk about structural ways to address gender-based violence, to try to put education, into schools. So I've always had a fascination to understand, why that exists, down under, right? The bravery to have these kinds of conversations. But through the work of people like yourself, I can see why, these conversations are happening. So, thank you very much. Would love to see if you have any sort of last words of wisdom for us or our audience.
Yeah, well, that's a good point you raised, because obviously, I'm only a recent arrival to Australia myself. I moved here last year, and I was also fascinated by what you were talking about, because I was aware as well that a lot of the men doing great work in this area seem to be Australian. And I was like, so being here has been fascinating, and unfortunately, I would not say that Australia is like some kind of utopia of gender equality. I mean, if anything, it seems like some men, have kind of risen up and become, really vocal advocates on these issues, precisely as a kind of pushback against the really intense pressures on masculinity that they've faced here, which obviously exist everywhere in the world, and they just manifest themselves differently in different contexts. But I guess maybe because of the history of Australia, which obviously Britain, my home country, is very much tied up in terms of colonialism, the oppression of indigenous people here, the connections with whiteness as well. I think that, there is, there is a very macho elements to the culture here, the obsession with sport, for example. So I think that's led to real discomfort among some men. So that might be why, we do. But yeah, of course, these are issues in every country, and actually in the UK, maybe it can actually be more pernicious, because sometimes things like sexism and misogyny can be more subtle, more under the surface. There's more that outward politeness, but under the surface, women are still being treated very differently, for example. So it manifests itself differently everywhere, but it's been fascinating to see how it works here. But one thing I would say as well, as you said about Australia, that they have been, there's a huge amount of work still to do. But one thing I think they have been recognizing more here than in some other countries is the role of gender inequality, in problems like violence against women and girls, that it's, and I think that that's something we have to recognize as well, right? That this is a structural problem. So as I was saying before, we each as individuals have a really important role to play here, but we also need to recognize that this is a structural thing. It is about who has power, who's being paid more in the workplace, what access to parental leave do we have? How much leave are men taking? How involved are men as fathers? What institutions do we prioritize as a society? Like we're seeing more investment in the military and in many countries at the moment, when meanwhile there are so many people living in poverty, or women, areas of the economy where women are more likely to work, they're not being paid as well. You know what I mean? Like, this is a structural thing as well. And so I guess one thing I would say that I think, for us as men to think about is we need to be simultaneously, I think, we gain so much from doing that inner work that we've been talking about a lot today, and I've benefited so much in my own life from attempting to do that, and everything I've learned from feminism, about attempting to do that, and I've gained so much from that. But also then, how can I take that then into my day-to-day life with the people I'm interacting with, but also, how can I take that in terms of pushing for wider social change as well, for a more equitable society, where we actually, as a society, prioritize some of the values we've been talking about today, like care and kindness and equality and non-violence, so yeah, I think the change is needed at every level, right, from inside ourselves to how our society itself is organized, and in the end that will benefit all of us. I have no doubt about that. Yeah.
And my co-host, any last words from you?
I would just say thank you so much, Dr. Burrell. It's a pleasure. And I think one last word to our listeners is to make sure with this armor, you continue to let it break down, and don't be scared to be vulnerable, and encourage your peers, and just build this community of respect and safety and vulnerability. And then this idea of aspirational masculinity and understanding others is just going to continue to spread outwards. Just continue to work on yourself, and with that, you'll help others as well.
Yeah, just echoing as well. Thank you, Dr. Burrell, for coming today. I appreciate how you also helped paint this picture of power structure and how masculinity plays into that. And also kind of building on Gabriel's thought, just do the small things in your own life, and we'll start to see change at this bigger structural level. So thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this episode.
Great. Well, my goodness. Again, I am so grateful for these opportunities to speak. Stephen, I'm very grateful for your work and your voice here. Our listeners, please check out the podcast, Men and Now. Stephen, is it available on most platforms?
Yeah, no, you should be able to find it wherever you look for
Absolutely.
podcasts. Yeah.
It is a great listen, because Men and Now is able to attract some of the leading minds and thought leaders in this space, and the conversations have helped me, learn the real definition of strength and courage. It takes strength and courage to be connected to who you are as a person. It takes strength and courage to follow through with who you know you are and what is the right thing to do. It is not strength and courage to follow along the path and go along with the status quo. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcasts on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about our student and executive programming at our website at ihavetherightto.org.